Before we begin, if you enjoy tales that weave history, dark humor, and the strange corners of the imagination into something just unsettling enough to keep you company at night, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions. Now settle in, because tonight's story is the first chapter in a curious little curse, one that began, as so many ill-fated things do, at a well. Chapter 1. The Incident at the Well. The village of Blackmore was the sort of place where nothing happened, which was precisely why anything that did happen was immediately deemed catastrophic. The well at the center of town was its beating heart, a crumbling stone mouth where gossip flowed as freely as water. It was here, on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday, that Thomas Pindle made his fatal mistake. Thomas was not a foolish man, or so he liked to think. He was a cooper by trade, which meant he spent his days shaping barrels and his nights shaping excuses to avoid the tavern. He was also, regrettably, a man of routine, and his routine involved fetching water from the well precisely at noon, when the sun was high enough to glare off the bucket, but not so high as to make the walk back unbearable. On this particular Tuesday, the well was not empty. Sitting on its mossy edge was old Marta, the village's resident witch, though no one ever called her that to her face. She was knitting something lumpy and indistinct, her gnarled fingers moving with a speed that suggested she was either very good at knitting or very bad at it. Thomas hesitated. There were rules about these things. One did not interrupt old Marta when she was knitting. One did not make sudden movements near old Marta. And above all, one did not, under any circumstances, ask old Marta what she was knitting. Thomas, being a man of routine, decided to fetch his water anyway. He cleared his throat politely, as one does when intruding upon a witch's knitting time. Old Marta did not look up. The needles clicked. The lumpy thing grew lumpier. Thomas coughed again, louder this time. "I'm not deaf, boy," old Marta said without glancing up. "Fetch your water and be gone." Relieved, Thomas lowered the bucket. It hit the water with a splash that was, in hindsight, unnecessarily vigorous. A few drops landed on old Marta's shoe. The knitting stopped. Thomas froze. The village had legends about old Marta's shoes. They were said to be made of something that was not quite leather, and no one wanted to know what. A single drop of well water now darkened the toe of her left shoe, and old Marta stared at it as though it had personally offended her ancestors. "You've spilled on my shoe," she said very quietly. "An accident," Thomas said, with the strained cheer of a man who knows he is about to become a cautionary tale. "A mere accident." Old Marta looked up at last. Her eyes were the color of mud left out in the rain. "Do you know what happens to men who spill on my shoe?" Thomas did not, but he was reasonably sure he was about to find out. The bucket, now full, weighed heavily in his hands. He considered throwing it at her and running, but witches were famously fast when provoked. "I'll clean it," he offered. Old Marta smiled. It was not a comforting smile. "Oh, Thomas," she said, and the fact that she knew his name was somehow worse than the smile. "You'll do much more than that." She reached into the folds of her shawl and pulled out a small withered thing that might have been a root or might have been a finger. Before Thomas could protest, she dropped it into his bucket. It sank without a sound. "There," old Marta said, satisfied. "No, you're cursed." Thomas looked down at the water. It looked back, perfectly ordinary. "That's it. For now," old Marta said, resuming her knitting. "Go home, Thomas. Drink the water. See what happens." Thomas, being a sensible man, seriously considered dumping the bucket onto the ground and pretending this had never happened. But old Marta was watching him, and the village had rules about wasting water. And besides, who believed in curses these days? He carried the bucket home. The first sign that something was wrong came that evening, when Thomas sat down to supper. His wife, Margaret, had made a lovely stew, or at least, it had been lovely before Thomas took a sip. To him, it tasted of ashes and salt, so overpowering that he gagged. Margaret, confused, took a bite herself and declared it perfectly fine. The second sign came when Thomas tried to sleep. The moment he closed his eyes, the dream began. A vast, dark well deeper than any well had a right to be, and from its depths came a sound like knitting needles clicking together. He woke in a sweat, his mouth dry as old bone. By morning, the third sign arrived. Thomas looked in the mirror and saw, just for a moment, not his own face, but old Marta's, grinning back at him. The curse had begun. Chapter 2. The First Night of Whispers. Thomas had hoped, against all reason, that the curse might wear off by nightfall. A foolish thought, of course, but desperation had a way of making men believe in impossible reprieves. The first day had been bad enough. The ash-tasting food, the unsettling reflection, the creeping sense that something was watching him from the corners of his vision. But nightfall brought something worse. Margaret, bless her practical soul, had dismissed his complaints as the result of bad ale or an overworked mind. She had gone to bed early, leaving Thomas to sit by the dying embers of the hearth, staring into the fire as if it might offer some explanation. It did not. Eventually, exhaustion dragged him to bed, though the thought of sleep filled him with a quiet dread. The moment he blew out the candle, the whispers began. At first they were faint, just on the edge of hearing. Soft, rhythmic mutterings that might have been wind through the eaves or mice in the walls. But Thomas knew better. The words, if they were words at all, had a deliberate cadence, like someone reciting a half-remembered rhyme. He lay perfectly still, barely breathing, straining to make sense of it. Then came the laughter. Not loud, not cruel, but they're all the same. A dry, crackling sound, like leaves skittering across stone. It was old Marta's laugh. He knew it instantly, though he had only heard it once before, years ago, when she had watched the village baker trip over his own feet and spill an entire tray of pies into the mud. She had laughed just like that, quiet and satisfied, as if the universe had delivered a private joke for her amusement. Thomas sat up, heart pounding. The room was dark, the air thick with the scent of tallow and wool. Margaret slept soundly beside him, undisturbed. The whispers continued, circling the bed now, snaking through the air like smoke. He could almost see them, curling at the edges of his vision, darting away when he turned his head. One voice separated itself from the rest, clearer than the others. "You shouldn't have spilled," it said, and Thomas felt a cold finger trace down his spine. He did the only sensible thing a man could do in such a situation. He pulled the blanket over his head and waited for dawn. Morning, when it came, was no relief. The whispers had faded with the first light, but their absence was not comforting. It felt like a pause, not an end. Margaret, ever observant, took one look at him over breakfast and sighed. "You look like you've been wrestling the devil," she said, pushing a bowl of porridge toward him. Thomas poked at it miserably. "I didn't sleep." "Bad dreams?" "Worse." Margaret gave him a long look, then reached across the table to pat his hand. "Eat. You'll feel better." He knew she meant well, but the thought of putting anything in his mouth made his stomach twist. The curse had taken even this from him, the simple pleasure of a meal. Still, he forced down a few bites, if only to avoid her worried stare. The day passed in a haze. Thomas went through the motions of his work, shaping staves and fitting hoops, but his mind was elsewhere. Every creak of wood, every distant voice made him flinch. By evening he was exhausted, his nerves frayed to threads. Night came again, and with it the whispers. This time they were louder. Thomas lay rigid in bed, listening as the voices wound around him, murmuring nonsense and half-threats in equal measure. "Shoes need mending," one said. "Dia well is deep," hissed another. Then, clear as a bell, "You'll see her soon." "Ja, he squeezed his eyes shut. "Go away," he muttered. The whispers paused. Then, as one, they erupted into laughter, soft, mocking, unbearably intimate. It was the sound of something enjoying his fear. Somewhere in the room, a floorboard creaked. Thomas opened his eyes. The corner of the room, where shadows pooled thickest, seemed to shift. A shape moved there, too tall to be human, too thin to be natural. It took a step forward, and the whispers grew louder, eager. Then Margaret rolled over, mumbling in her sleep, and the thing in the corner vanished. The whispers fell silent. Thomas did not sleep that night, or the next. By the third evening he was a wreck, pale, twitching, jumping at every sound. Even the villagers had begun to notice, though they kept their distance. No one wanted to get involved in a curse, especially one involving old Marta. That night, the whispers did not wait for darkness to fall. They started at dusk, slithering out of the corners of the house, wrapping around Thomas like a second skin. "She's coming, and," they said. "She's coming, she's coming, she's coming." In. Thomas, for the first time in his life, considered running. But where does a man run from a witch's curse? The answer, as the whispers gleefully reminded him, was nowhere at all. Chapter 3. The Milk That Wouldn't Churn. Thomas had always prided himself on being a practical man. He could fix a leaking barrel with his eyes closed, mend a broken cart axle with nothing but twine and stubbornness, and predict rain by the ache in his left knee. But practicality was useless against witchcraft. It started with the milk. Margaret rose before dawn, as she always did, to tend to their single cow, Bessie. The animal had been in a peculiar mood for days, her eyes rolling white whenever Thomas came near, as if she sensed the curse clinging to him like an odor. Still, she gave milk as usual, and Margaret carried the pail inside, setting it on the table with a satisfied thump. "Churn this after breakfast," she told Thomas, already tying her apron for the day's work. "We're low on butter." Thomas nodded, though the thought of food still turned his stomach. He waited until Margaret was out in the garden before dragging himself to the churn. It was a simple thing, a wooden barrel with a plunger, worn smooth from years of use. He poured the milk in, took a deep breath, and began to work the handle. At first, nothing seemed amiss. The milk sloshed as it always did, the rhythmic creak of the plunger filling the quiet kitchen. Then, slowly, the resistance grew. The handle became heavier, as if something in the churn were pushing back. Thomas frowned, gripping tighter, putting his weight into it. The plunger refused to move. He yanked it upward. The milk let out a wet, sucking sound. Thomas peered inside. The milk stared back. It wasn't curdling. It wasn't even thickening. It was just sitting there, perfectly white, perfectly liquid, as if the very idea of butter offended it. He tried again. The handle groaned. The milk sloshed mockingly. By the time Margaret returned, Thomas was sweating, his arms trembling from exertion. The milk remained unchanged. She took one look at the churn, then at him. "Are you ill?" "It won't turn," Thomas said, his voice hoarse. Margaret nudged him aside and took the handle herself. With one firm push, the plunger sank smoothly. She gave him a look that suggested he was either lazy or losing his mind. Thomas watched in dull horror as the milk thickened, then separated, then became butter in a matter of minutes. Margaret worked with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times, which, of course, she had. "There," she said, scooping out the fresh butter. "Nothing wrong with it." Thomas said nothing. He didn't trust his voice. The incident at the churn was only the beginning. Later that day he tried to mend a broken stool. The moment his hands touched the wood, the legs twisted farther apart, the joints groaning like living things in pain. The nails he hammered in bent sideways, refusing to hold. By the time he gave up, the stool was less a piece of furniture and more a tangle of splinters. Margaret found him sitting in the wreckage, his hands bleeding from a dozen tiny cuts. She didn't scold him this time. She just looked at him, really looked, and for a moment Thomas thought she might finally understand. Instead, she sighed and said, "Go fetch water. I'll fix this." A well. Thomas hadn't been back since the curse began. The thought of returning made his skin prickle, but he couldn't refuse. Not when Margaret was watching him like that, her patience wearing thinner by the day. The walk to the well was longer than he remembered. The villages he passed avoided his gaze, though he caught a few whispering behind their hands. Word traveled fast in Blackmore. The well loomed ahead, its stone mouth dark and gaping. Thomas half expected old Marta to be there, knitting her terrible little shapes. But the space was empty. The bucket sat where it always did, waiting. He lowered it slowly, listening to the creak of the rope. The bucket hit the water with a splash. When he pulled it up, the water inside was black. Not murky. Not shadowed. Black as ink, black as a moonless night. Thomas stared at it. The water stared back. Then, as he watched, it cleared. By the time the bucket reached the top, the water was ordinary again, sparkling innocently in the sunlight. Thomas carried it home without drinking. Margaret used the water to make soup. It tasted like ashes. That night, the whispers returned, louder than ever. They didn't bother with words now. They just laughed, a sound like dry sticks breaking, as Thomas lay awake and wondered what would break next. The answer came at dawn. He woke to Margaret's scream. Bessie's milk had turned sour overnight. Not the usual kind of sour that could still be used for cheese, but the kind that curdled in the pail, thick and yellow, reeking of rot. The cow herself stood stiff-legged in the barn, her sides heaving, her milkless udder dripping something that was not milk at all. Margaret didn't look at Thomas this time. She just walked away, her shoulders stiff with something worse than anger. Fear. And Thomas, for the first time, understood the true nature of the curse. It wasn't just haunting him. It was unraveling his life, one thread at a time. Chapter 4. The Shadows That Follow. Thomas had grown accustomed to the whispers, the sour milk, the way tools turned traitor in his hands. These were tangible torments, things he could point to and say, "This is the curse at work." Reboot. The shadows were different. The shadows were worse. It began with a flicker. He was in the workshop, sanding down a barrel stave, when he noticed it, a darkness shifting just beyond his sight. When he turned his head, there was nothing. Just the usual play of light through the warped glass of the window. He went back to work. Then it happened again. This time, he saw it clearly. His own shadow, cast against the wall by the afternoon sun, had raised its hand when he had not. Thomas froze. The shadow froze. For a breathless moment they stared at each other, man and silhouette, each waiting for the other to move first. Then the shadow waved. Thomas dropped the stave. By the time he gathered the nerve to look again, the shadow was behaving normally. It mimicked his movements with perfect fidelity, as shadows ought to do. But the damage was done. He could no longer trust the dark. That evening, as he trudged home, the shadows followed. Not just his own, but every shadow. The long stretch of the fence posts, the jagged outline of the trees, even the small, shapeless blot of a pebble on the path. They didn't move when he moved. They slithered. Margaret noticed his unease. "You're twitching like a skinned rabbit," she said, stirring the pot over the fire. Thomas didn't answer. He was too busy watching her shadow on the wall. It wasn't stirring a pot. It was knitting. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, the shadow was normal again. Nightfall brought no relief. The whispers had grown bolder, no longer content to hover at the edges of hearing. They crowded around the bed now, murmuring directly into his ears in voices that were almost but not quite human. "Shazy's jung, they said. Thomas pulled the blanket over his head. It didn't help. The whispers seeped through the wool, insistent as damp. She sees you right now. He squeezed his eyes shut. The darkness behind his eyelids was no longer safe. It pulsed alive, forming shapes that almost made sense. A crooked finger, a needle, a pair of eyes the color of old mud. Then, just as sleep began to drag him under, he felt it. A breath on the back of his neck, cold and deliberate. Thomas bolted upright. The room was empty. Margaret snored beside him, undisturbed. The whispers had gone quiet, but the air smelled faintly of wet earth and rotten herbs, a scent he knew all too well. Old Marta had been in the room. Or something worse. Dawn came gray and grudging. Thomas rose stiffly, his body aching, as if he'd spent the night running. Margaret, already dressed, gave him a look that was equal parts pity and exasperation. "You're wasting away," she said. Thomas didn't argue. He could feel the truth of it in the looseness of his clothes, the hollows beneath his eyes. The curse was eating him, bite by bite. He spent the morning in the workshop, though he accomplished little. The shadows were worse indoors, pooling in the corners like spilled ink, thickening when he wasn't looking. More than once he caught them stretching toward him, fingers of darkness grasping at his ankles. At noon he gave up and went to the tavern. The Black Hen was crowded, the air thick with the smell of ale and unwashed men. Normally, Thomas would have found comfort in the noise, the familiar rhythm of village gossip. Today, the voices grated. He took a seat in the corner, as far from the firelight as possible. The ale, when it came, tasted of nothing. He drank it anyway. "You look like death," said a voice beside him. Thomas turned. It was Eli, the blacksmith's son, a man whose good humor was matched only by his inability to mind his own business. "Bad week," Thomas muttered. Eli leaned closer. "They say old Marta's got her eye on you." Thomas' grip tightened on the tankard. "Who says?" "Everyone." Eli took a swig of ale. "Old Tom the shepherd swears he saw your shadow walking without you yesterday, down by the mill pond." Thomas' blood went cold. He hadn't been near the mill pond in days. Eli mistook his silence for skepticism. "Ah, Tom's half blind anyway. Probably saw a goose and got confused." He clapped Thomas on the shoulder. "Still, maybe stay out of her way, eh?" Thomas didn't answer. He was too busy watching the shadow of Eli's hand, which remained on his shoulder long after the real hand had withdrawn. The fingers curled, digging into his coat like claws. He left without finishing his ale. The walk home was worse than ever. The shadows of the trees leaned over the path, their branches knitting together overhead, blocking out the sun. The few villagers he passed didn't meet his eyes. Even the dogs gave him a wide berth, their tails tucked between their legs. When he reached the house, Margaret was nowhere to be seen. The fire was out. The table was set for one. Thomas sat alone, chewing tasteless bread, and tried not to notice the shadows creeping up the walls. They moved like liquid, slow and deliberate, converging toward a single point, the empty chair across from him. By the time he went to bed, the chair's shadow had grown teeth. That night, the whispers didn't bother with words. They just laughed, low and wet, as the shadows pressed in. Thomas didn't sleep. He didn't dare. Chapter 5. The village turns cold. Thomas had known these people his entire life. He had shared meals with them, celebrated births and mourned deaths with them, borrowed their tools and mended their fences. But now, as he walked through Blackmore's single muddy street, he might as well have been a ghost. The baker, who had always greeted him with a joke and a warm roll, turned his back when Thomas approached. The butcher's wife crossed herself as he passed. Even the children, who had once clamored for rides on his cart, now hid behind their mother's skirts when he drew near. The curse had leaked beyond the boundaries of his home, seeping into the very air around him, tainting everything he touched. Margaret had stopped pretending everything was normal. She spoke to him only when necessary, her words clipped and careful, as if afraid the curse might leap from his tongue to hers. She slept with her back to him, the space between them in the bed growing wider each night. Thomas tried to ignore it. He threw himself into his work, though the barrels he made now had a habit of warping overnight, their staves twisting into strange, knotted shapes. He avoided the well. He avoided old Marta's cottage. Most of all, he avoided looking at his own shadow, which had developed a troubling tendency to linger when he walked away, staring after him with eyes it shouldn't have. But there was no avoiding the village forever. Market day arrived, and with it, the grim spectacle of Blackmore's collective unease. Thomas stood at his usual stall, displaying his wares, or what was left of them. The few barrels that hadn't warred were snapped up quickly, the buyers tossing coins onto the table without meeting his gaze. Then came the whispers. Not the nighttime whispers that plagued his sleep, but human ones, sharp and deliberate. Touched by the witch, someone muttered. Brought it on himself, another answered. Thomas pretended not to hear. He focused on counting coins, though his hands shook badly enough to make the task difficult. A shadow fell across the table. Thomas looked up to see Father Craddock, the village priest, looming over him. The man's face was unreadable, his hands tucked into his sleeves like a pair of nesting birds. Thomas, he said, nodding gravely. Father Dortixi. Craddock eyed the empty space around Thomas's stall, where customers usually crowded. Troubling times. Thomas said nothing. What was there to say? The priest leaned closer, lowering his voice. There are concerns. Concerns. About your condition. Craddock's gaze flickered toward Thomas's shadow, which was at that moment examining its own hands with far more interest than a shadow should possess. Some fear it may be catching. Thomas barked a laugh, harsh and sudden. And what would you have me do? Leave? Craddock's expression tightened. The well-being of the flock. The flock? Thomas stood abruptly, knocking over a stack of coins. I've lived here 30 years, dug your graves, fixed your roofs, drunk your ale. And now I'm what? A blight? The market had gone quiet. Every eye was on them. Craddock drew himself up. No one is casting accusations, but these are strange signs, Thomas. The milk, the shadows, the... My wife hasn't left me, Thomas snapped. Yet? A murmur rippled through the crowd. Craddock's mouth pinched. Perhaps it would be best if you... Best for who? The priest didn't answer. He didn't need to. The way the villagers edged away from Thomas's stall said enough. Thomas packed up his remaining wares in silence. No one offered to help. No one spoke. The only sound was the whisper of his shadow trailing after him, its footsteps out of sync with his own. That night, the house felt colder than usual. Margaret had left a pot of stew on the hearth, but the fire had died to embers, and the meat was congealed in its own grease. Thomas ate it anyway, though it tasted of nothing. He was scraping the bowl clean when the knock came. 3 sharp raps, the sound of bone on wood. Thomas froze. Margaret, who had been mending a sock by the weak light of a candle, looked up sharply. Don't answer it, she said. The knock came again. Louder. Thomas stood. His shadow didn't. It remained seated, watching him with something like amusement. The door rattled on its hinges. Margaret's needle stilled. Thomas stirred. He crossed the room in 3 strides and flung the door open. The doorstep was empty, but pressed into the mud was a single footprint, too large to be human, its toes ending in long, claw-like marks. And beside it, a small withered thing that might have been a root or might have been a finger. Thomas slammed the door. Behind him, Margaret let out a small, broken sound. When he turned, she was staring at his shadow, which had finally risen, only to stand a full head taller than Thomas. Its arms stretched toward the ceiling in a mockery of prayer. "Get out," she whispered. Thomas opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat. Because Margaret wasn't looking at his shadow anymore. She was looking at him. And in her eyes he saw the same fear the villagers had shown. The same revulsion. The same certainty that whatever stood before her was no longer the man she'd married. Thomas turned away. His shadow followed, slinking along the walls like a beaten dog. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and rotten herbs. And laughter. Always laughter. Chapter 6. Dreams of the Witch's Hut. Sleep had become a battleground. Thomas fought it as long as he could each night, pacing the cottage until his legs gave out, pinching his arms raw to stay awake. But exhaustion always won. The moment his eyes closed, the dream took him. It began the same way every time, with the smell. Rotting herbs. Wet earth. The metallic tang of something buried too long. The scent wrapped around him before he even opened his eyes, thick as a burial shroud. When he did look, he was standing in a clearing he knew but had never visited, the space before old Marta's hut. The hut itself was exactly as the villagers described, crooked as a bad tooth. Its thatch black with mildew, its walls leaning as if the whole structure were trying to slink away into the woods. The door hung slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. Thomas tried to move, to run, but his body wasn't his own in this place. His legs carried him forward without his consent, each step crunching on brittle twigs that sounded suspiciously like bones. The door creaked wider as he approached. Inside, the hut was larger than it should have been, its walls lost in shadow. The only light came from a single candle on a table in the center of the room, its flame burning an unnatural green. Old Marta sat beside it, knitting. She didn't look up as Thomas entered. Her needles clicked steadily, weaving something that squirmed in her lap. "Late," she said. Thomas tried to speak, but his tongue was heavy as lead. Marta sighed and set her knitting aside. What had been a shapeless mass now resolved itself into a tiny, perfect replica of Thomas's shadow, complete with two long fingers and eyes that blinked up at him. She dropped it to the floor where it scurried into the dark. "You're a disappointment," she said, finally meeting his gaze. Her eyes were black in the candlelight, depthless. Most men beg by now. Thomas found his voice. "What do you want?" Marta smiled, revealing teeth filed to points. "Wrong question." The candle flared. The shadows on the walls twisted into shapes. A gallows, a grave, a man running from something unseen. "You should be asking," Marta continued, picking up her needles again, "what you can give me." Thomas swallowed. His mouth tasted of ashes. "I have nothing left." The needles paused. "Liar, good vende." A sound came from the darkness, a wet, rhythmic noise, like something being dragged through mud. Thomas turned his head, though every instinct screamed not to. Margaret stood there, or something wearing Margaret's face. Its skin sagged unnaturally, as if the bones beneath had softened. Its mouth moved, but the voice that came out wasn't hers. "Stay with us," it said. Thomas stumbled back. The thing that wasn't Margaret reached for him, its fingers stretching impossibly long. Marta cackled. "She misses you already." The candle guttered. The hut dissolved. Thomas woke screaming. Dawn light seeped through the cracks in the shutters. Margaret's side of the bed was empty, the sheets cold. He found her in the kitchen, stirring a pot with mechanical precision. She didn't look up when he entered. "You were talking in your sleep," she said. Thomas' throat ached. "What did I say?" Margaret's steering slowed. "You begged." The day passed in a haze. Thomas went through the motions of work, though his hands shook too badly to hold a chisel. The villagers gave him an even wider berth today, their whispers trailing after him like a bad smell. Even the animals seemed to sense something amiss. Crows lined the rooftops as he passed, their heads cocked in eerie unison. By evening, he was exhausted, his nerves frayed to nothing. But sleep was the last thing he wanted. It came for him anyway. The dream began as before, the clearing, the hut, the door creaking open. This time Marta wasn't knitting. She stood by the table, where the green candle now burned blue. Laid out before her were 3 objects: a key, a nail, and a withered brown root. "Choose," she said. Thomas' hand moved without his consent, hovering over each item in turn. The key was cold to the touch, the nail warm, the root pulsing faintly, as if alive. The thing that wasn't Margaret watched from the shadows, its head lolling on a neck too thin to support it. "Wrong choices make for long nights," Marta crooned. Thomas's fingers closed around the root. Marta clapped her hands. The hut shook. The candle flared white-hot, its wax spreading across the table like blood. "Clever boy," she hissed. The root squirmed in his grip, sprouting fine hairs that burrowed into his skin. Pain lanced up his arm, sharp as a knife. Thomas tried to scream, but his mouth was full of earth. He woke choking. Something was wrong with his hand. In the dim moonlight he could see dark veins spreading from his palm, branching up his wrist like ivy. When he flexed his fingers they ached dully, the joints stiffening as if with age. Across the room his shadow sat upright in bed, watching him. Margaret was gone. The cottage door stood open, letting in a breeze that smelled of rotting herbs. From the darkness outside came a sound like knitting needles clicking together. Thomas didn't sleep again that night. By morning, the veins had reached his elbow. Chapter 7. The Unending Itch. At first, Thomas thought it was just sweat. The morning had dawned unusually warm for the season, the air thick with the promise of coming rain. But as he dressed, the sensation persisted, a prickling along his arms, like tiny insects marching beneath his skin. He scratched absently at his forearm, expecting relief. None came. By midday, the itch had spread. It started in earnest along the dark veins that now mapped his left arm, branching from palm to elbow in ugly, twisting rivers. Then it crept upward, across his shoulders, down his back, until every inch of him burned with a needling discomfort that no scratching could satisfy. Thomas rubbed his arms raw against the doorframe. He dragged his nails down his chest until blood welled in thin red lines. Still, the itch remained, burrowing deeper, as if his very bones had developed a rash. Margaret returned from the market to find him shirtless in the yard, pouring a bucket of well water over his head. The cold should have helped. It didn't. "You're bleeding," she said, setting her basket down carefully, as if afraid to startle a wild animal. Thomas raked his nails down his ribs again. "I know." Margaret didn't offer to help. She just stood there, watching him scratch with a kind of horrified fascination. "You need a healer." Thomas barked a laugh that turned into a groan as the itch flared along his spine. What healer would touch me now? Margaret didn't answer. She didn't need to. The village healer had barred his door when Thomas approached last week, hanging a wreath of hawthorn that burned to the touch. The water dripped from Thomas's hair, running in pink-tinged rivulets down his chest. The itch laughed at his efforts, redoubling its assault, until his muscles twitched with the need to tear his own skin off. Margaret took a step back. "I'll fetch more water." She didn't return. Night brought no mercy. If anything, the darkness made it worse. Thomas lay rigid in bed, his fingers clenched in the sheets to keep from clawing his face open. Every scratch only seemed to anger the itch further, spreading it like oil on water. The whispers at least had stopped. They'd been replaced by something worse, a dry, rustling sound like dead leaves being rubbed together that seemed to come from inside his own skull. "Piech osung," it murmured. Thomas dug his nails into his thigh. Blood welled, sticky and warm. The itch purred. Kalediva, Tirans was Libya, Kananikai Shalibil Pay. Randelieten, is it on the capacity? Guides, Estabedibos. He barely slept. When he did, his dreams were of old Marta's hut, where the witch sat peeling what looked like strips of bark from a gnarled log. Except the log had fingers. Except the log was screaming. Thomas woke with a jolt, his right hand already tearing at his stomach. The skin there was rough now, ridged like tree bark in places. The dark veins pulsed beneath, threading through him like roots through soil. Margaret wasn't in bed. She hadn't come home at all. The realization should have hurt more than it did. But Thomas was too busy fighting the urge to take a knife to his own arms, to peel back the skin and see what writhed beneath. Dawn found him, kneeling in the yard, his arms buried to the elbows in the cool, damp earth. It helped, a little. The itch quieted to a dull roar, soothed by the soil. For the first time in hours, Thomas could breathe. Then he tried to stand. The earth held fast. Thomas yanked his arms free with a sickening tear, like roots being pulled from the ground. His skin, no, not just skin now, something harder, something fibrous, was streaked with dirt that clung stubbornly as if it belonged there. The itch roared back with a vengeance, worse than before. Thomas stumbled into the house, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The hearth was cold. The table was bare. Margaret's things were gone. A noise from the doorway made him turn. His shadow stood there, watching him with its two long fingers twitching. When it moved, it didn't mimic Thomas. It scratched itself, slow and deliberate, its nails sinking into its shadow flesh, as if it could reach the itch Thomas couldn't. The sight made him sick. Or maybe that was the curse, digging its fingers deeper into his guts. Thomas grabbed his cloak and fled. The village was waking as he staggered through its streets. Doors slammed shut as he passed. Windows darkened with hastily drawn curtains. No one would meet his eyes. Except one. Old Marta sat on the steps of the abandoned mill, her knitting needles flashing in the morning light. She didn't look up as Thomas approached, though her lips curled in a smile that showed too many teeth. "Morning, Thomas," she said, as if they were old friends meeting by chance. "You look itchy." Thomas's hands clenched. The bark-like skin of his palms cracked, oozing something that wasn't quite blood. "Take it back." Marta's needles clicked. "Take what back?" "The curse." His voice broke on the word, raw as his ruined skin. Marta finally looked up. Her eyes were black pits, bottomless. "Oh, Thomas," she sighed. This was never a curse. She held up her knitting. It wasn't wool on those needles, but strands of dark, fibrous material that glistened wetly in the light. Thomas's stomach turned as he recognized the texture, the same as the patches spreading across his skin. Marta smiled wider. "This is a gift." Thomas backed away, his heart hammering. The itch burned through him, worse than ever, as if responding to her words. Behind him, his shadow laughed, the sound like dry leaves crumbling to dust. Thomas ran to the Bedenso. He didn't stop until he reached the woods, where the trees stood silent and judging. There, beneath an ancient oak, he fell to his knees and dug his fingers into the earth, desperate for relief. The itch subsided, just a little. Above him, the oak's branches creaked in a wind that didn't blow. Thomas closed his eyes and scratched. Chapter 8. The Animals Know. Thomas had always gotten on well with animals. Dogs greeted him with wagging tails. Hens clucked contentedly when he gathered their eggs. Even old Bessie, stubborn as she was, would nudge his shoulder for treats. But now, as he limped back toward the village from the woods, the creatures of Blackmore looked upon him with something far worse than indifference. The first sign came from the miller's tabby, a fat creature that usually dozed in the sun without a care. When Thomas passed, the cat's fur stood on end, its back arching like a drawn bow. It hissed, revealing needle-sharp teeth, then fled as if the devil himself were after it. Thomas rubbed his arm. The itch had quieted some since his time in the woods, but the dark veins still pulsed beneath his bark-rough skin. He wondered if that was what the cat had seen. The answer came soon enough. Old Man Hobbs' sheepdog, a gentle beast that had once licked Thomas's hand, now snarled and snapped at the air as he approached the fence. Its lips curled back in a vicious grimace, spittle flying as it threw itself against the rails, desperate to reach him, or escape him. "Down, Rex!" Hobbs shouted from the field. Then he saw Thomas, and his face went gray. Without another word, he grabbed the dog's collar and dragged it inside, slamming the door behind them. Thomas stood alone in the lane, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The itch flared along his ribs in response to his racing heart, as if the curse enjoyed his discomfort. He needed to get home, if he still had a home. The village proper was worse. Every chicken in Widow Cress's yard flapped into a squawking frenzy as he passed, their beaks gaping in silent screams. A stable cat bolted across his path, its tail bottle-brushed with terror. Even the flies, usually bold enough to land on any warm body, kept their distance, buzzing angrily just out of reach. Thomas kept his head down and walked faster. Then came the crows. They lined the rooftops in ragged rows, their beady eyes tracking his progress down the street. Not one caught, not one stirred. They simply watched, still as death, as the cursed man shuffled past. Thomas could feel their gaze like fingers on his spine. The final insult came from the butcher's yard. The pigs, normally indifferent to anything but their next meal, screamed when they caught his scent. Not the usual grunts and squeals of livestock, but proper human-like shrieks that raised the hair on Thomas's neck. They threw themselves against the pen walls, their eyes rolling white with terror, until the butcher came running with a cudgel. When he saw Thomas, he didn't even curse. He just crossed himself and backed away, leaving the pigs to their panic. Thomas fled. The cottage was empty when he arrived, just as he'd left it. No sign of Margaret. No note. Just the cold hearth and the lingering scent of her rosemary soap. Thomas sank onto the bed, his bark-patched hands trembling. The itch had returned full force, crawling beneath his skin like a nest of ants. He scratched absently at his forearm, wincing as a patch of skin flaked away like dry paper. A noise outside made him freeze. Scratching. Not the small, frantic scrabbling of a mouse, but something larger, something deliberate. Thomas crept to the window and peered out. Bessie stood in the yard, her great head lowered, her hooves pawing at the dirt. The cow had always been half wild, but this was different. Her nostrils flared as she sniffed the air, her sides heaving. When she turned her head, Thomas saw her eyes, wide, white-rimmed, the same look she got when wolves were near. Then she charged. The cottage shook as Bessie rammed the door, her horns gouging deep furrows in the wood. Thomas stumbled back as she struck again, the timbers groaning under the assault. "Bessie!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Stop!" The cow bellowed, a sound more rage than fear, and threw herself against the door once more. The latch held, but just barely. Thomas backed toward the fireplace, grabbing the iron poker with his ruined hands. The itch burned through him, worse than ever, as if feeding on his terror. With a final crash, the door gave way. Bessie stood in the opening, her flanks heaving, foam dripping from her mouth. For a long moment she just stared at Thomas, her nostrils flaring. Then, with a noise halfway between a moan and a scream, she turned and fled into the twilight. Thomas sank to the floor, the poker slipping from his grasp. His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart pounding loud enough to drown out the whispers that usually filled his skull. Outside, The crows began to caw. That night, Thomas didn't dream of the witch's hut. He dreamed of running through the woods on all fours, his body light and strange, his nose full of the scent of fear. When he woke at dawn, his mouth tasted of blood, and his nails were caked with earth. On the pillow beside him lay a single black feather. Thomas rose stiffly, his joints popping like green wood. The patches of bark-like skin had spread overnight, creeping up his neck, down his chest. He scratched at them absently as he shuffled to the door. The yard was empty. No Bessie, no birds, just the trampled earth and the faint, lingering stink of animal terror. Thomas stepped outside, his bare feet sinking into the cool dirt. The itch quieted at the contact, soothed by the earth. For the first time in days, he felt something like peace. Then the wind shifted, carrying with it the sound of a child's laughter, and beneath it, the steady click of knitting needles. Thomas turned his face to the woods and ran. Chapter 9. The Failed Remedies. Thomas had exhausted pride long ago. When dawn crept through the trees after his night of running through the woods on all fours, he went to the only person in Blackmore who might still speak to him. Old Tam the shepherd lived in a ramshackle hut at the village edge, where the smell of sheep dung overpowered even the stench of Thomas's curse. The old man opened his door just a crack at Thomas's knock, his milky eye gleaming in the dim light. "You're still walking on 2 legs, Tam observed. "That's something." "I need help," Thomas said. His voice sounded wrong, raspy, like bark scraping against bark. Tam sighed but opened the door wider. The hut smelled of damp wool and bitter herbs. "You'll not find a witch-breaker here," he warned, stirring a pot over the fire. "But I've seen a curse or two in my time." Thomas held out his arms, showing the bark-like patches that now covered half his flesh. The dark veins pulsed beneath, threading through him like tree roots through soil. Tam sucked air through his remaining teeth. "That's a bad one." He rummaged in a chest near his pallet and produced a yellowed bone hung with feathers. "Hare's foot. Carry it in your left pocket." Thomas took it gingerly. The moment it touched his palm, the bone turned black and crumbled to dust. Tam crossed himself. "Right, next remedy." The old shepherd tried everything. A paste of moonwort and egg white that bubbled and hissed when applied to Thomas's skin. A chant in a tongue so old even Tam didn't know its meaning. Even the classic remedy, urinating in a circle while facing east, only resulted in Thomas's water coming out thick and black, smelling of rotting leaves. Each failure made the itch worse. By midday, Thomas was clawing at his neck, his fingers coming away sticky with sap-like fluid. "There's one last thing," Tam said, eyeing Thomas's deteriorating condition. From under his pallet, he produced a small iron box. Inside lay a single silver coin, edges worn smooth. "Put this under your tongue and say her name backwards." Thomas frowned. "Atram?" The moment the word left his lips, the coin grew scorching hot. Tam yelped and dropped it. The silver melted before it hit the floor, pooling into a shape that looked unsettlingly like a grinning mouth. Thomas's shadow, which had been unusually quiet all morning, suddenly stood upright on the wall and clapped its hands. Tam backed away until he hit the far wall. "Out," he whispered. "Get out." Thomas ran. He went next to the abandoned church at the edge of the graveyard. The priest had long since barred him from the proper one, but this crumbling stone shell would have to do. Inside, where the roof had collapsed, Thomas knelt in a patch of sunlight and tried to pray. The words turned to ash in his mouth. From the broken altar came a sound like knitting needles, clicking together. Thomas fled again. His last hope was the wise woman 3 villages over, a toothless crone who was rumored to have once bested a witch in a staring contest. The walk took most of the afternoon, his body stiffening with every mile, the bark-like patches spreading across his joints. Children pointed as he passed. Dogs howled. The wise woman took one look at him from her doorway and spat. "Marta's work," she said. "I'll not touch that." "I'll pay," Thomas croaked. "With what? That skin of yours?" She chuckled darkly. "Only one way out of a curse like that, boy." Thomas leaned forward. "Tell me." The wise woman grinned, showing blackened gums. "Give her what she wants." Then she slammed the door. Night found Thomas crouched by a roadside stream, scrubbing his arms with sand until they bled. The water reflected his face back at him, or what was left of it. His eyes had darkened, the whites now yellowed like old parchment. His lips cracked like drying mud. He plunged his hands into the water, desperate for relief. The stream turned black around his fingers, the current carrying the darkness downstream like spilled ink. Fish floated belly up, their scales peeling away in strips. Thomas yanked his hands back. The bark had grown over his fingertips now, hardening into proper claws. When he scratched his arm, the itch only laughed and burrowed deeper. In the distance, an owl called. Not the usual soft hoot, but a shrill mocking sound that echoed through the trees. Thomas knew that call. He'd heard it in his dreams. He turned his face toward Blackmore and began the long walk home, if home still existed for such a creature as he'd become. The moon rose full and heavy, painting the road silver. Thomas's shadow walked beside him now, no longer tethered to his movements, its fingers trailing through the grass like roots seeking water. Somewhere, far away, a woman laughed. Thomas scratched at his neck and walked faster. Chapter 10. The Witch's Laughter in the Wind. The wind had teeth tonight. It gnawed at Thomas's tattered clothes, nipped at his bark-rough skin, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something darker, something that curled in the back of his throat like rotting fruit. And beneath it all, threading through the gale like a needle through cloth, came the laughter. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even constant. Just a hiccup of sound here, a dry chuckle there, always just when Thomas thought he might have imagined it. The first time he heard it, he spun around so fast his newly stiffened joints popped. The road behind him lay empty, moonlight pooling in the ruts like liquid silver. Then the wind shifted, and there it was again, old Marta's laugh, as clear as if she stood right beside him. Thomas ran. Or tried to. His body didn't move like it used to. His feet, half-rooted now, dragged through the dirt, leaving shallow trenches that smelled disturbingly of fresh-turned earth. The wind pushed at his back, herding him toward Blackmore, the laughter growing louder with every stumbling step. By the time the village came into view, Thomas's breath came in ragged, whistling gasps. His chest creaked with each inhale, the sound like branches rubbing together. The patches of bark had spread overnight, merging into a second skin that cracked at the joints but otherwise held fast. The village slept, or pretended to. No lights showed in the windows. No dogs barked at his approach. Even the ever-present crows had abandoned their posts, leaving the rooftops bare. Thomas's cottage stood dark and empty, the door still hanging from its hinges where Bessie had broken it. He hesitated on the threshold, his clawed hand hovering over the frame. A gust of wind shoved him forward, carrying with it a whisper that might have been words or might have been leaves rustling. Inside, the air smelled of rosemary and absence. Margaret's things were gone, her apron from its peg, her good shoes from by the door, even the little clay figurine of St. Agnes she'd kept on the windowsill. Only the faintest indentation in the bed's straw mattress remained to show she'd ever been there at all. Thomas sank onto the cold hearthstone, his weight making the wood beneath groan. The itch had quieted some, lulled by his exhaustion or perhaps satisfied with its work. He flexed his hands, watching the way the firelight played across his bark-like skin, turning the grooves between patches into rivers of shadow. A sound outside made him freeze. Not laughter this time, but something worse. A rhythmic scraping like a branch against glass. Thomas crept to the window. The yard stood empty. The moon painted everything in shades of blue and black, turning the trampled earth into a patchwork of shadows. Then one of those shadows moved. Not his own this time that stood beside him watching with its two long fingers twitching, but something else. Something that unfolded from beneath the empty water trough, with the slow, deliberate grace of a spider emerging from its nest. It stood on two legs, roughly man-shaped, but its head lolled on a neck too thin to support it. The moonlight slid off its surface like water off oiled cloth, revealing nothing but a suggestion of limbs, a hint of something that might have been a face. It turned toward the house. Thomas ducked below the windowsill, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The wind rose again, rattling the shutters, and in it he heard old Marta's voice as clearly as if she stood beside him. "Not much time now," she crooned. The scraping came again, closer this time. Thomas risked another glance. The shadow thing stood just outside the door now, its head cocked at an angle no human neck could manage. As he watched, it raised one hand, long, too long, and placed it against the doorframe. The wood darkened where it touched, warping inward as if rotting in fast motion. Thomas backed away, his heel catching on the uneven floorboards. The noise was small, but the shadow thing's head snapped up instantly. It didn't have eyes, not that Thomas could see, but he felt its gaze like fingers on his skin. Then the wind changed direction, carrying with it the sharp, unmistakable sound of knitting needles clicking together. The shadow thing hesitated. Its head turned toward the woods, where the trees swayed in a wind that didn't touch the village. For a breathless moment it stood frozen between Thomas and whatever called from the darkness. Then it was gone, melting into the night like fog under morning sun. Thomas didn't move for a long time. The wind howled around the cottage, rattling the loose shutter, but beneath it he could still hear that damned laughter, ebbing and flowing like tide against shore. Eventually he crawled to the empty bed and curled in on himself, his body creaking like green wood in a storm. Sleep took him despite his terror, dragging him under with greedy hands. He dreamed of roots. They wrapped around his legs, his arms, his throat, pulling him down into cool, damp earth. It should have been terrifying, but the itch was gone here, buried under layers of soil and silence. Above him, barely visible through the tangle of roots, a shadow moved, long fingers working, knitting something from strands of darkness. A voice, muffled by earth but unmistakable, whispered, "Almost ready." Thomas woke choking on the taste of soil. Dawn light filtered through the broken door, painting stripes across the floor. Outside, the wind had died, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. No laughter. No scraping. Just the distant call of a single crow, its voice sharp as a knife on stone. Thomas sat up, his body protesting the movement. The bark had spread while he slept, covering his shoulders, creeping up his neck. When he scratched at it, flakes fell away like dead skin, revealing fresh growth beneath. From the woods, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of someone humming. Thomas closed his eyes and counted to 10. When he opened them again, his shadow stood at the foot of the bed, holding something in his elongated hands, a small, roughly woven shape that might have been a noose or a crown. It grinned at him with a mouth full of splinters and held it out. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying with it the scent of rotting herbs and a sound that might have been a whisper or might have been leaves rustling. "Come home," it said. Chapter 11. The crops wither. Thomas had avoided the fields since the curse began. There was no need to tend them now that Margaret was gone, and the villagers had made it clear his help wasn't wanted. But hunger drove him out at last, a deep, gnawing emptiness that no amount of water or stale bread could fill. His stomach growled like a living thing as he shuffled toward the communal garden plot where Blackmore grew its cabbages and turnips. The first sign something was wrong came when his shadow touched the furrows. Where it passed, the leaves of the nearest plants curled inward, their edges browning as if scorched. Thomas paused, watching as a fat cabbage withered before his eyes, its outer leaves blackening like paper held to flame. He took a step back. His shadow lingered, stretching across the road to caress another plant. That one shriveled too, its stem collapsing into mush. A sound made him turn. Young Jem Carter stood frozen at the edge of the field, his watering can dripping onto his bare feet. The boy's mouth hung open, his eyes wide with horror as they darted between Thomas and the dying plants. Thomas raised a hand, half apology, half plea, but Jem turned and ran, his screams bringing others to their doors. By midday, the news had spread. Thomas watched from his cottage window as a group of villagers gathered at the field's edge, pointing at the blackened rows where his shadow had fallen. Their voices carried on the still air, sharp with fear. He touched nothing. Jem insisted, his voice cracking. Just walked near and they died. Old Tam crossed himself. Earth rejects him, he muttered. Bad sign. The village headman, a stout man named Brewer, knelt and poked at one of the withered plants. When he stood, his face was grim. Salt the ground where he walked, he ordered. And someone fetch the priest. Thomas let the curtain fall. His hands shook as he examined them. The bark-like skin had spread up to his elbows now, the dark veins pulsing just beneath the surface. When he flexed his fingers, they creaked like old wood. Hunger gnawed at him again, sharper this time. Not the usual bellyache of an empty stomach, but something deeper, as if his very bones were starving. He needed to eat. Needed it, like he needed breath. The garden was out of the question now. But the forest. The thought came unbidden, slithering into his mind like one of old Marta's whispers. The forest had always provided nuts, berries, mushrooms in season, and the itch always quieted among the trees. Thomas waited until the villagers dispersed before slipping out the back way, his shadow trailing behind like a tattered cloak. The summer sun beat down, baking his hardening skin, but the moment he stepped under the forest canopy, cool relief washed over him. The itch subsided to a dull murmur, soothed by the damp earth and rustling leaves. He found a patch of wild strawberries first, their red hearts bright against the green. But when he plucked one, it turned black in his fingers, collapsing into a heap of moldy pulp. The same happened with the hazelnuts, their shells split open at his touch, revealing worm-riddled husks inside. Even the mushrooms, usually so plentiful, shriveled into poisonous-looking twists when he reached for them. Thomas sank to his knees, the hunger roaring in his ears. Around him, the forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. A rustle in the undergrowth made him look up. A rabbit crouched a few yards away, its nose twitching. It should have fled. Any sensible creature would have. But this one just watched him, its dark eyes unblinking. Thomas moved without thinking. His body, stiff and creaking just moments before, unfolded with sudden, terrifying grace. He was on the rabbit before it could react, his clawed hands closing around its warm flesh. It didn't struggle, didn't scream. One just looked at him as its life drained away between his fingers. The blood smelled rich and coppery, stirring something deep in Thomas's gut. Before he could think better of it, he brought the carcass to his mouth and bit down. The meat was tough, gamey, but it filled him like nothing else had in weeks. He ate greedily, tearing into flesh and bone alike, the blood running down his chin to soak into the earth below. When he finished, nothing remained but a few tufts of fur. The forest exhaled around him. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches whispering secrets to one another. Thomas wiped his mouth, his fingers coming away stained red. The hunger had quieted, but something else had taken its place. A low, throbbing pulse that matched the rhythm of the dark veins beneath his skin. He stood slowly, his body feeling strangely light. His shadow stretched long before him, its edges blurred, as if it couldn't quite decide what shape to take. A sound made him turn. A dry, familiar chuckle from somewhere deep in the woods. The wind carried the scent of rotting herbs, stronger now than before. Thomas took a step toward it. Then another. Behind him, Where the rabbit's blood had soaked into the earth, a single dark shoot pushed through the soil, unfurling its first leaf with a sound like a sigh. Chapter 12. The Mirror's Distortion. Thomas hadn't looked in a mirror since the morning he'd seen old Marta's face, staring back at him. But the hunger that had driven him to the rabbit had left him feeling strange. Stronger, yes, but also less himself. When he stumbled upon a rain barrel outside the abandoned mill, its surface still enough to cast a reflection, he hesitated only a moment before peering in. The face that looked back wasn't his. It wasn't old Marta's either. Something in between, a grotesque merging of man and tree, with bark-like skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, eyes gone black as wet soil, lips peeled back from teeth that had grown too long. Thomas raised a trembling hand to his face. The reflection did the same, but its fingers ended in jagged claws where Thomas's own were merely rough and cracked. A ripple passed over the water's surface, though there was no wind. When it stilled, the reflection had changed again. Now it was old Marta, her grin wide enough to split her face, her knitting needles flashing as they wove something dark and squirming. "Like what you see?" the reflection asked in Marta's voice, though Thomas's lips hadn't moved. He staggered back, kicking the barrel in his haste. The water spilled across the dirt, black as ink, and the laughter followed him as he ran. His cottage offered no sanctuary. The moment he crossed the threshold, he noticed the small looking-glass Margaret had kept by the door, the one she'd used to pin up her hair each morning. It lay face up on the floor, though Thomas could have sworn he'd left it on the shelf. He should have turned away, should have smashed it and been done. But the same morbid curiosity that makes men press on bruises drew him closer. His reflection this time was worse. The bark had spread up his neck, encasing his throat in a rough, ridged collar. His eyes were completely black now, no whites remaining. And behind him, clear as day in the glass though the room was empty, stood the shadow thing from the yard, its elongated fingers resting on Thomas's shoulders in a mockery of comfort. Worst of all were the roots. They sprouted from his reflection's mouth, thin and white as maggots, writhing like living things. When Thomas opened his mouth to scream, his reflection smiled, and the roots pushed out between his teeth in the glass. He grabbed the mirror and hurled it against the wall. The glass shattered, but the laughter remained, bubbling up from each shard where they lay glittering on the floor. That night, Thomas dreamed of standing in a grove of twisted trees, their branches heavy with strange fruit. Each fruit was a face. Margaret, the villagers, even old Tam, their mouths sewn shut with coarse thread. At the center stood a tree unlike the others, its trunk split wide to reveal a hollow just his size. "Almost ready," whispered a voice from within the hollow. Thomas's own face peered out at him, its mouth full of roots. He woke with a start to find his hands buried wrist-deep in the dirt floor of the cottage. The bark had grown up to his jaw now, and when he moved, the sound was less flesh than foliage rustling. From outside came the sound of something scratching at the door. Not the shadow thing this time, but many small somethings, their claws clicking against the wood like a hail of dried peas. Thomas didn't move to investigate. He already knew what he'd find. The rabbit's bones had come home, and they brought friends. Chapter 13. The Sleep That Never Comes. Thomas had forgotten what true rest felt like. The curse had stolen sleep from him piece by piece, first with whispers, then with dreams, and now with something far worse. His body ached with exhaustion, his thoughts moving sluggishly through his mind like fish trapped in frozen water. Yet every time he closed his eyes, something yanked him back from the brink of unconsciousness with cruel precision. He lay on the cold dirt floor of the cottage, having given up on the bed when its straw mattress had begun sprouting thin white roots that twined around his limbs. The scratching at the door had ceased an hour ago, replaced by a new torment, a rhythmic tapping at the window, like a branch kept alive by the wind. Except there was no wind tonight, and the tree outside had been dead for years. Thomas squeezed his eyes shut, willing sleep to come. For a brief, blessed moment, darkness crept in at the edges of his vision. Then the tapping turned to scraping, and the scraping to a sound like fingernails dragging down glass, and his eyes flew open once more. The window was empty. Of course it was. He rolled onto his side, his bark-covered skin rasping against the packed earth. The itch had changed since he'd eaten the rabbit. No longer a surface irritation, but something deeper, as if his very marrow had gone dry and was crumbling inside his bones. He scratched at his forearm anyway, the sound like a dull knife on old wood. From the corner of the room, his shadow chuckled. It had taken to moving independently more and more, no longer content to simply mimic Thomas's actions. Sometimes he caught it watching him with its head tilted at that impossible angle, its two long fingers twitching as if knitting invisible threads. Other times, like now, it seemed content to simply observe his suffering with quiet amusement. Thomas bared his teeth at it. The shadow bared its own, longer, sharper, and grinned. Dawn came grudgingly, the light filtering through the cracks in the shutters gray and thin as old broth. Thomas hauled himself upright, his joints popping like green wood in a fire. The tapping at the window had stopped with first light, but the silence it left behind was somehow worse, heavy and expectant, like the pause between lightning and thunder. He shuffled to the door, his steps uneven. The bark had spread overnight, creeping up his neck to brush the line of his jaw. When he touched his face, his fingers came away, flecked with what looked like moss. Outside, the world had changed. The grass in the yard lay flat and blackened, as if scorched. The few scraggly plants Margaret had nurtured by the doorstep were withered husks, their stems twisted into grotesque shapes. Even the air felt different, thicker, harder to breathe, as if the very atmosphere resisted his presence. Thomas turned his face toward the woods. The trees stood unnaturally still, their leaves barely stirring in the morning breeze. Something in their stillness called to him, a silent invitation he couldn't refuse. His shadow followed at a distance, its steps soundless. The forest welcomed him as it always did, the itch quieting the moment he crossed under the canopy. The usual sounds of birds and rustling creatures were absent today, leaving only the creak of branches and the occasional dry rattle of leaves. Thomas moved deeper into the trees, his feet finding paths he didn't remember knowing, his hands brushing against trunks that felt strangely warm beneath his fingers. He came to a clearing he'd never seen before, a perfect circle of bare earth, at the center of which stood a single gnarled oak, its roots twisted above the ground like arthritic fingers, forming a hollow just large enough for a man to crouch inside. Thomas knew this tree. He'd seen it in his dream. A breeze stirred the leaves, carrying with it the scent of wet earth, and something darker. Something metallic. The hollow in the tree beckoned, its darkness pulsing like a living thing. Rest, whispered the wind, or perhaps it was his shadow, now standing so close he could feel its chill breath on his neck. Rest and grow. Thomas took a step forward. Then another. The roots at the base of the tree shifted as he approached, uncurling like sleeping serpents to make room. The hollow yawned before him, dark and inviting. For the first time in weeks, Thomas felt something like peace. He crouched at the entrance to the hollow, his stiff limbs protesting. The space inside was just large enough, the walls smooth as if worn by countless hands. When he leaned back, the roots rearranged themselves around him, cradling him like a child in a mother's arms. The itch was gone here, the whispers silent. Even his shadow seemed content to wait at the edge of the clearing, its form flickering like candle flame in a draught. Thomas closed his eyes. This time, nothing pulled him back. The sleep that took him was deep and dreamless, a darkness so complete it felt like sinking into rich black soil. His body relaxed for the first time in weeks, the bark on his skin softening, the roots in his mouth. When had they gotten there? Curling contentedly. Somewhere, far away, a woman laughed. Thomas didn't hear. He was already gone. Chapter 14. The Children's Rhymes. Thomas awoke to singing. The sound drifted through the hollow of the great oak, high and clear and terribly innocent. Children's voices weaving through the trees like smoke. For a moment he lay still, savoring the strange peace that had settled in his bones during his sleep. The roots that had grown through his fingers and around his wrists felt natural now, an extension of himself rather than an affliction. Then the words of the song registered. Old Tom's gone to the forest deep, where the roots grow long and the shadows creep. His nikavante bale, Lilia Panta by decided. Is he doing? First he'll walk and then he'll crawl. Until he's not a man at all. It this was this year now. Good on the living. Continuing day. Thomas sat up abruptly, his newly grown roots protesting the movement. Sunlight filtered through the branches above. It was late afternoon, possibly evening. He had slept the day away in the heart of the tree. The singing continued, closer now. Bark for skin and sap for blood. Feet stuck fast in mud like wood. Nice. When the moon is high and white, Old Tom's tree will walk tonight. Thomas peered through the gaps in the roots encircling the hollow. A group of village children danced at the edge of the clearing, their small hands linked as they circled a pile of twigs arranged in a crude man shape. Even from this distance, Thomas recognized Jem Carter and the miller's youngest girl among them. Their game would have been harmless if not for the details. The twigman had acorns for eyes that wept dark sap, and the children had crowned it with a scrap of cloth that looked suspiciously like a piece of Thomas's old shirt. As he watched, the littlest child, a boy no more than 5, broke from the circle and approached the twig figure with a wooden bowl in his hands. With solemn ceremony, he poured something dark over the makeshift head. Blood, Thomas realized with a jolt. Chicken blood, most likely, still fresh enough to steam slightly in the cool evening air. The children shrieked with laughter as the twigman soaked up the offering, their voices taking on the chanting rhythm again. Roots to fingers, leaves to hair. Zone he'll sleep and never stir. Unless the lady comes to call, way. Wooten the tree must walk and walk and walk. Thomas tried to stand, but the roots held him fast. Not painfully, not like restraints, more like a mother's hand keeping a child from wandering into danger. Through the tangle of wood, he saw the children suddenly freeze, their game forgotten as they stared at something behind him. The singing died mid-verse. A branch cracked. A shadow fell across the clearing. The children scattered like leaves in a gale, their screams fading into the trees. Thomas didn't need to turn to know who stood behind him. The scent of rotting herbs and wet earth filled the hollow, thick as fog. Sweet, isn't it? Old Marta's voice was like dry bark rubbing together, the way they always know. Her gnarled hand appeared in his field of vision, resting on one of the roots that bound him. Where her fingers touched, the wood darkened, spreading like ink in water. They made the same rhymes about me once, she continued. Her breath smelled of turned soil and bitter roots. Children always sense the changing first. Thomas tried to speak, but his mouth was full of roots now, his voice reduced to a creaking whisper. Marta laughed and patted the side of the tree. Don't fret, sapling. You're nearly ready. She moved around to face him, her shawl knitted from what looked like shadows and spider silk. In her hands were the ever-present needles, clicking away as they wove something that squirmed. Thomas's eyes widened. The yarn was the same color as his missing shadow. Tomorrow, Marta said, her smile stretching too wide. When the moon is high and white. She leaned closer, her breath cold against his bark-covered cheek. Then you'll walk. With that, she was gone, her laughter lingering like the scent of turned earth after rain. The roots relaxed their hold, but Thomas didn't move. The children's song echoed in his mind, its words settling into his heart with the weight of prophecy. When the moon is high and white, Old Tom's tree will walk tonight. As dusk fell, the first roots began pushing up through the clearing soil, pale and questing. They twined around Thomas's ankles with the familiarity of old friends, anchoring him in place. He didn't resist. Somewhere in the distance, a child's voice took up the song again, soft but clear in the gathering dark. Walk and walk and walk. Chapter 15. The final confrontation. The moon hung fat and white above the trees as Thomas wrenched himself from the oak's embrace. Roots tore free from his wrists with wet, snapping sounds, oozing sap that smelled of copper and loam. He stumbled forward, his movements jerky as a marionette's, the last vestiges of his humanity warring with what he was becoming. The children's song echoed in his skull, each verse a drumbeat driving him forward. Walk and walk and walk. He would find Marta. He would end this. The forest parted before him, branches twisting aside to clear a path. Where his feet touched the earth, pale roots surged up to greet him, twining around his ankles before sinking back into the soil. The itch was gone now, replaced by terrible growing certainty. He was running out of time. Marta's hut stood in its clearing, just as it had in his dreams, its crooked chimney puffing smoke that coiled like grasping fingers against the night sky. The door stood open, inviting. Thomas hesitated at the threshold. This was too easy. After weeks of torment, after the creeping transformation of his very flesh, this quiet welcome rang false. "Come in, sapling," Marta's voice called from within. "You're letting the damp in." His first step across the threshold sent a shock through his body, the wooden floorboards trembling beneath his feet. The hut's interior stretched far larger than its exterior suggested, the walls lost in shadow, the ceiling hidden by hanging bundles of herbs that swayed, though no wind stirred them. At the center sat Marta in her rocking chair, knitting needles flashing as always, her gnarled fingers working something dark and squirming. Thomas tried to speak, but his voice came out a rasping whisper, his throat lined with something fibrous. "Why?" Marta didn't look up from her work. "Why not? You cursed me. Did I?" Her needles clicked. "Or did I simply help you become?" Thomas took another step forward, his fingers curling into claws. "Undo it." Marta laughed, the sound like dry leaves crumbling. "Can't unring a bell sapling. Can't unroot a tree." The anger that surged through Thomas then was hot and bright, cutting through the creeping numbness of his transformation. He lunged, his bark-covered hands reaching for the witch's throat, and froze as Marta finally looked up. Her eyes were gone. Where they should have been, two knotholes gaped, dark and depthless. Her grinning mouth stretched too wide, lined with splinters. The thing in her lap wasn't yawn at all, but strands of his own shadow, woven into a noose that pulsed with his heartbeat. "You still don't understand." The thing that wasn't Marta said. Its voice was the creak of branches in wind, the groan of roots splitting stone. "I'm not making you into anything." It stood, unfolding to a height that made Thomas stumble back. The knitting needles clattered to the floor, the half-finished shadow noose unraveling as it rose. "You were always this," it continued, gesturing to Thomas's bark-covered arms. "I just helped you remember." The hut's walls groaned as they stretched upward, the thatched roof peeling away to reveal the moon's cold eye. The thing wearing Marta's shape shed its skin like birch bark, revealing something older beneath, something of twisted wood and grasping roots, its form shifting like trees in a gale. Thomas fell to his knees, the last of his strength leaving him. The roots surged up through the floorboards to cradle him, their touch gentle now, almost reverent. "You fought well," the forest murmured through Marta's grinning mouth. "But all saplings must bend or break." Moonlight poured through the ruined roof, painting Thomas's bark-skin silver. He could feel it happening now, the last of his softness hardening, his thoughts slowing like sap in winter, his roots digging deep into the welcoming earth. Somewhere, far away, children's voices sang. "Roots to fingers, leaves to hair. Sown he'll sleep and never stir." The forest's laughter followed him down into the dark, where the roots cradled him close, and the earth sang lullabies only trees could hear. And when the villagers came at dawn, armed with axes and fire, they found only an ancient oak where Marta's hut had stood, its branches heavy with strange fruit that whispered in the wind. But that, as they say, is another story. Chapter 16. The Price of Freedom. Thomas awoke rooted. The great oak held him in its embrace, his body now more tree than man, bark encasing his torso, branches sprouting from his shoulders, roots twining through his legs like lovers' fingers. The forest murmured around him, leaves whispering secrets in a language he almost understood. Marta, or what had worn Marta's face, was gone. Only the oak remained, its ancient bulk humming with a slow, vegetative patience. Yet something human still clung stubbornly inside him. He remembered Margaret's laugh, the weight of a well-made barrel, the taste of summer ale. These fragile things anchored him, kept the forest from swallowing him whole. A rustle in the undergrowth. The real Marta emerged, looking older than the hills and twice as tired. Her knitting needles were still now, tucked into her belt like weapons. "You took your time waking," she said, pressing a hand to his bark-covered chest. "Most don't." Thomas strained to speak. Sap bubbled at his lips. "Why?" Marta sighed and sat at his roots, her bones creaking louder than his branches. "Because someone's got to tend the forest. And I'm old, boy." The truth unfolded slowly, like a new leaf unfurling. The curse wasn't punishment. It was recruitment. The whispering shadows, the creeping bark, even the children's rhymes, all steps in an ancient dance, a passing of the guard from one caretaker to the next. Marta drew a knife from her shawl. "There's a way out if you're brave enough." Thomas watched moonlight glint along the blade. He thought of Margaret's empty side of the bed, of the villager's fearful eyes, of the hollow in his chest, where his heartbeat used to live. Marta pressed the knife into his stiffening fingers. "Cut yourself free before dawn, and you'll walk away human." She leaned close, her breath smelling of mint and grave dirt. "But the forest needs tending. Someone must stay." Thomas looked down at the blade, at his rooted feet, at the waiting trees beyond. Somewhere a nightingale sang. Marta smiled, showing teeth like cracked acorns. Shoes, sapling. The knife trembled in his grip, not from fear, but from the roots spreading through his muscles, stilling his human weakness. Thomas made his choice. The first cut was the deepest. Chapter 17. The Lingering Echo. The knife fell from Thomas's fingers, its blade black with sap and something darker. The roots had released him, slithering back into the earth like chastened serpents, but the marks remained, whorls of bark-like scarring across his skin, a stiffness in his joints that the dawn light couldn't warm away. Marta was gone. In her place stood a new oak, its branches heavy with acorns that gleamed like obsidian in the morning light. The forest hummed with satisfaction, its newest caretaker taking root. Thomas stumbled toward the village, his body aching with each step. The cuts had healed suspiciously fast, leaving silver scars that itched in the sunlight. He scratched absently at his forearm, then froze when his nails came away, flecked with dried leaves instead of skin. Blackmore looked different in daylight, smaller, shabbier, the thatch roofs patchy as an old man's beard. The villagers stopped their morning chores to stare as Thomas limped past. Their eyes tracked the way his shadow stretched too long behind him, how it sometimes moved a heartbeat after he did. Margaret's cottage stood empty, the door still hanging from its hinges. Someone had nailed a hawthorn branch across the threshold, its berries shriveled black. Thomas pushed past it, the thorns drawing blood that oozed slow and thick as sap. Inside, the hearth was cold. The smell of rosemary had been replaced by mildew and damp. On the table lay a single item, Margaret's wedding band, tarnished and lonely. Thomas reached for it, then jerked back when his fingertips brushed the metal. It burned like ice. Outside, children's laughter drifted from the square. Their song had changed. Old Tom's gone, but left his skin. Walked away, but still leaves in eye. Every root and every tree. Watch your step or you might see. The verse cut off abruptly as their mothers shushed them. Thomas peered through the cracked shutter to see the women herding the children inside, their faces drawn with fear. Only little Jem Carter remained, staring straight at Thomas's window with unsettling certainty. The boy mouthed 2 words before his mother dragged him away, still watching. The well was Thomas's last stop. He needed to see it one final time, the place where this had all begun. The bucket swayed gently in the morning breeze, its rope creaking like old bones. When Thomas looked down into the dark water, his reflection wavered, then stilled. For the first time in weeks, it showed only his own face, weathered, scarred, but human. Then the surface rippled, and just for an instant, Marta's grin flashed beneath his own. A gust of wind sent autumn leaves skittering across the stones. One caught on Thomas's sleeve, oak, not maple. He plucked it free, only to find it stained red at the stem. The village square lay empty now, doors bolted, windows shuttered against him. Thomas turned his back on Blackmore, his shadow stretching long before him. It moved wrong still, its edges blurred as if not quite attached. The road out of town was overgrown, barely visible beneath brambles and creeping vines. At the forest's edge, he hesitated. The trees whispered his name, their branches beckoning. Somewhere deep in the wood, something that was and wasn't Marta waited. Thomas took a step forward, then another. Behind him, the village children began to sing again, their voices carrying on the wind. Walk and walk, and never stop, till the roots grow up, through your heart and through your head. Better you than us, they said. Thomas scratched at his bark-scarred wrist and walked on. The itch would never leave him now. He could feel it in his bones. This was only the beginning. Some curses don't end. They just change shape. Chapter 18. The Witch's True Motive. The forest welcomed Thomas back with rustling leaves and creaking branches, the trees bending just enough to let him pass. He walked until the village sounds faded, until the only light came filtered green through the canopy. Here, the air smelled different, not of rotten herds as it had around Marta, but of damp earth and living wood. A root caught his foot, not to trip him but to guide. Thomas let it steer him deeper, to a clearing he'd never seen before. At its center stood a stump, wide as a wagon wheel, its rings dark with age. Their cuts were fresh though, the wood still weeping sap where the axe had bitten. Thomas knelt without knowing why, and pressed his palm to the raw wood. The vision came like a lightning strike. He saw Marta, not the crone he'd known, but a young woman with fire in her eyes. Saw her standing in this very clearing, arms outstretched as villagers circled with torches. Saw the mayor's ancestor, blacksmith's hammer in hand, shouting about blight and bad harvest. Most of all, he saw the tree. Not an oak, but an ancient yew, its branches heavy with crimson berries. The village's heart tree, some whispered. Their protector since the first cottages were built. The axe fell. Again. Again. When the yew toppled, a sound like a screaming woman tore through the forest. Young Marta collapsed, blood streaming from her nose and mouth. The villagers cheered as the timber was dragged away to build the mayor's new house. None noticed the way their children's laughter sounded sharper afterward. How the milk soured too fast. How shadows began lingering at the edges of sight. Thomas gasped, wrenching his hand from the stump. The vision faded, but the truth remained, bitter on his tongue. The curse wasn't random cruelty. It was justice delayed by generations. A debt come due. A twig snapped behind him. You understand now. The voice was Marta's but wasn't. Thomas turned to see a figure woven from leaves and twilight, its eyes two knotholes into nothing. "They called me witch after that day," it said. "So I became one." The figure gestured to the stump. "Every curse needs an anchor. Every wrong needs righting." Thomas looked down at his own hands, the bark scars pulsing faintly. "Why me?" The figure laughed, a sound like wind through dead branches. "Why not? Your great-grandfather swung the axe. His hands live in yours." The pieces clicked together. The well incident hadn't been chance. It had been a test, a measuring. And Thomas, like a fool, had spilled on the wrong shoes. The figure stretched out a twig finger, tracing Thomas's scars. "You could have stayed, become the new heart tree. The village might have loved you then." Thomas thought of the shuttered windows, the children's songs, Margaret's abandoned ring. "They'll never forgive me." "No," the figure agreed. "But the forest might." It dissolved into a swirl of leaves, leaving Thomas alone with the stump and his thoughts. The scars itched terribly now, but when he scratched, fresh green buds pushed through his skin. Somewhere deep in the wood, a yew sapling stretched toward the light. Chapter 19. The Village's Secret. The stump guided Thomas deeper into the forest's memory. Each step sent visions flashing behind his eyes, not just of the felled yew, but of what came after. The mayor's new house standing proud with heartwood beams. The way laughter died whenever young Marta passed. The whispers that followed her to the well each morning. Then came the winter of the blight. Thomas saw it unfold like a play. Crops failing despite the rain. Children coughing blood into their porridge. The way the village elders gathered in the mayor's yew-beamed house, their faces lit by firelight and fear. "They say she talks to trees," the blacksmith muttered. "Worse," the miller added. "She curses them." That night they came for Marta with torches and rope. Thomas watched the vision unfold with growing dread. They dragged her not to some righteous gallows, but back to the clearing where the yew had stood. No trial. No last words. Just a noose thrown over the sturdiest branch they could find. A young oak barely old enough to bear such weight. As Marta's body twisted in the wind, the oak's leaves turned black and fell. By morning both tree and corpse were gone, leaving only a scattering of dead leaves and the faint scent of rotting herbs. The vision shifted. Thomas saw generations of Pindles living in that yew-beamed house. His ancestors, their faces eerily similar to his own. Saw the slow decay of the village as the forest pushed back. As drying up. Livestock born twisted. Shadows moving where no shadows should be. Most damning of all, he saw the truth about the well where his curse began. It wasn't just any well. It marked the spot where the yew's roots had run deepest. The villagers had paved over their shame with stones, but some memories refused to stay buried. Thomas stumbled back from the stump, his bark-scarred hands trembling. The pieces fit together too perfectly. His family's fine house built from murder. The village's slow strangulation by its own guilt. Even the timing of his curse, coming exactly 100 years after Marta's hanging. A wind stirred the leaves, carrying whispers Thomas couldn't quite decipher. The scars on his arms itched fiercely, but when he scratched, his fingers came away sticky with sap instead of blood. From the corner of his eye, movement flickered. The shadow, his shadow, stood apart from him now, its shape indistinct, its edges blurred like ink in water. "Now you know," it whispered in Marta's voice. Thomas turned slowly, expecting the leaf-twisted figure again. Instead, he found himself face to face with something far worse, a reflection of himself as he might have been. The Thomas who stayed rooted. The Thomas who became the new heart tree. This other Thomas stood tall and straight, his skin smooth bark, his hair a crown of living branches. His eyes were deep pools of still water, reflecting nothing but sky. They needed a new anchor, the tree Thomas said. You were chosen. The real Thomas backed away, his heel catching on an exposed root. Because of my family. The tree Thomas shook his head, acorns rattling in his hair. Because you could choose differently. A sound like distant thunder rolled through the clearing, though the sky was clear. The ground trembled beneath Thomas's feet, not in fear but in recognition. The forest knew him now. Knew his blood. Knew the debt that ran in his veins. His shadow stretched long between them, tethered to both Thomas's yet belonging to neither. The tree Thomas reached out a branch hand. Stay, help me grow. For a heartbeat Thomas hesitated. The peace in those tree-deep eyes called to him, promising an end to itching scars and villagers' scorn. He could sink roots here, let the forest rewrite him, become something purer than human. Then he thought of Margaret's abandoned ring, of little Jem's knowing eyes, of the way the village children's song still echoed in his skull. Thomas turned and ran. Behind him the tree sighed, its leaves whispering a new verse to add to the children's song. Run and run and never rest. Carry both curse and guess, and the debt is paid in full. Goak and you and human fool. The words followed Thomas all the way back to the village border, where the first houses stood dark and unwelcoming. His scars burned with every step, the sap seeping through his shirt like blood from old wounds. Some secrets aren't meant to be uncovered. Some debts demand payment in full. Thomas scratched at his weeping scars and walked on. Chapter 20. The lesson in the curse. Thomas stood at the village crossroads, his shadow pooling at his feet like spilled ink. Dawn painted the cottages in pale gold, making the shuttered windows seem like closed eyes refusing to look at him. The scars no longer itched. They throbbed now, a slow, steady pulse that matched the rhythm of the forest at his back. He could leave. The road stretched east toward towns that didn't know his name or his blood. He could walk until the bark scars faded, until his shadow behaved, until the children's songs no longer echoed in his dreams. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of hearth smoke and baking bread. Underneath it all lingered the unmistakable tang of rotting herbs. Thomas turned toward the well. The stones were warm under his palms as he leaned over the edge. The water below showed his reflection, still human, still broken, but something new flickered in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before the curse. You always were a slow learner, Marta's voice whispered from the depths. Thomas smiled for the first time in months. I had poor teachers. A bubble rose in the water, popping to release the faintest chuckle. The reflection shifted, showing not Marta's face, but the village as it might be. The yew sapling grown tall in the square, children climbing its branches instead of singing rhymes of fear. The mayor's house stood rebuilt with ordinary timber, its proud beams replaced by humble pine. The curse wasn't for you, the water murmured. It was for them. Thomas understood then. The itching scars, the creeping bark, the whispers in the dark, none of it had been meant to break him. It had been meant to wake him. To wake all of them. A child's voice piped up behind him. You're supposed to be a tree. Yem stood there, his smudged face solemn, a basket of eggs clutched tight against his chest. Thomas knelt, wincing as his stiff joints protested. Sometimes things don't turn out how we expect. Jem considered this, then reached into his basket. He held out a perfect brown egg. For your journey. The egg was warm, alive, but Thomas cradled it gently, feeling the faint pulse within. When he looked up, Jem was already walking away, his bare feet kicking up little puffs of dust. The road still beckoned. The forest still whispered. Thomas tucked the egg into his pocket and made his choice. He walked not east toward escape, but west toward the mayor's house, the one with the yew wood beams. His shadow followed, for once moving in perfect time. At the door he hesitated only a moment before knocking. The sound echoed through the house, a sharp report like an axe biting wood. Some curses end. Some transform. And some, the best ones, Teach. The door creaked open. Thomas smiled. "Let's talk about your foundation," he said. And somewhere deep in the forest, an old oak and a young yew grew just a little bit taller.